stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we can't do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if Zoom or YouTube fatigue hasn't fully set in, many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Back to tonight's event. The program will likely run about 40 minutes, followed by audience Q&A. Suzanne and Dinaw will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. Please keep your questions concise so that they can answer as many as possible. Also know that you can view the event on Crowdcast or our YouTube page if you want to utilize the closed captioning feature. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Dr. Madeline Levine about how to best serve our children while playing dual roles of parent and teacher during the COVID-19 epidemic. Suketu Mehta with Esme Jimenez about the strength of countries who warmly receive immigrants, and a future file featuring Cass Sunstein, Aaron Brockovich, Tom Hartman, Jill Lepore, Senator Sherrod Brown, Senator Chris Murphy, Michael Ian Black, and Alex Ross in conversation with the great Ann Powers. You'll find plenty more about most of the above already online at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civics series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But fundamentally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization. So I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Thanks for purchasing a ticket to tonight's event. The response to COVID-19 has posed unprecedented challenges to nonprofits. If you support Town Hall's mission to make ideas and inspiration accessible to the whole community, we hope you will consider further support with a membership or by making a donation through the button at the bottom of your screen. This isn't an easy time for booksellers either, and since we know you will want to go deeper into the issues of tonight's discussion, I urge you to buy a copy of the book here tonight through our local independent partners at Third Place Books, using the button at the bottom of the screen. All right, on to our program. As the CEO of PEN America, our nation's leading organization devoted to human rights and free expression, Suzanne Nossel is a leading voice on these issues in the United States and globally. Suzanne held senior State Department positions in the Clinton and Obama administrations, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and more. She also previously served as the executive director of Amnesty International USA and as chief operating officer at Human Rights Watch. Dinaw Mengestu is the author of 3 novels, each one a, quote, New York Times notable book, unquote. All our names from 2014, 2010's How to Read the Air, and The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears from 2007. A native of Ethiopia who came with his family to the United States at the age of 2, Mengestu is also a freelance journalist who has reported about life in Darfur, northern Uganda, and eastern Congo, in articles appearing in the New York Times, New Yorker, Harper's, Granta, Jane, and Rolling Stone. Suzanne Nossel's first book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, is the subject of tonight's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Suzanne Nossel and Dinaw Mengestu.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Suzanne, for having this conversation. It's such a pleasure to actually have a conversation that I feel like we've had the pleasure of doing over email many times, and to do it really in the context and in the sort of light of this book, which I think brings so many issues that are sort of revolving and dominant in our culture right now. I have a lot of questions, and I was thinking maybe before jumping into that conversation, we'd get you to actually read for maybe a few minutes from the book so people can get a sense not only of your voice, but also where your background is and how that background formed the writing of this text.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm delighted to be here. And thanks so much to the Seattle Town Hall and to you for doing this with me tonight, and for those who have joined us. So, okay, I'm going to read a couple pages. In 2009, this is from the author's notes, so right at the beginning of the book. In 2009, I joined the volunteer serving at the State Department and focusing on human rights issues at the United Nations. That's where the seeds of this book were planted. One of our priorities was a UN resolution championed by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, a grouping of Muslim-majority countries. The tract sought to prohibit the so-called defamation of religion, meaning speech that denigrated particular religious beliefs. The premise was that voicing such hostile attitudes, contempt for Muslims in particular, could fuel discrimination, bigotry, and hate crimes. The push to ban defamation was sparked by a controversy several years earlier over the publication by a Danish newspaper of cartoons that spoofed the Muslim prophet Muhammad. The caricatures triggered peaceful protests, but also, several months after the fact, violent reprisals in more than a dozen countries. Western civil society organizations and governments, including the United States, opposed the anti-defamation resolution on the basis that it would impinge on human rights, particularly freedom of expression. So twice a year in New York and in Geneva, we would rally countries to vote against it. Although we always lost, our campaigning was steadily eating away at the majority backing the resolution. The exercise struck me as absurd. The Islamic Conference countries feared violent bigotry and sought a worldwide injunction on derogatory speech to curb that harm. Though their preferred solution was wrong, the problem they faced, anti-Muslim prejudice, was real. Meanwhile, the biennial diplomatic fight accomplished nothing to either address Islamophobic animus or advance free speech. Colleagues and I argued for a shift in strategy. We wanted to offer an olive branch, saying that we shared the concerns about discrimination toward Muslims and wanted to work with the Islamic Conference on an alternative resolution centered on practical measures to address it. Things including dialogue, education, and beefed up prosecutions for hateful crimes. In return, we would ask the conference to abandon the quest to ban the so-called defamation of religion. The proposed bargain didn't go over well at first. Within the State Department, many fretted that by showing any willingness to negotiate, we would telegraph weakness and end up forfeiting our unstinting defense of free speech. Most Muslim diplomats could not fathom giving up on their treasured resolution. Pakistan was chairing the Islamic Conference, and I fought to make a trip there to formally offer our proposal. It was so difficult to schedule a call with my key interlocutor that I ended up finally being put through during the wee hours of a Sunday morning, speaking from a hotel broom closet so as not to awaken my sleeping family. When the trip was scheduled, State Department officials could not agree on language for us to present, so a Foreign Service colleague and I had to invent it on the fly, working late on embassy grounds in Islamabad. We explained to the Pakistani officials that the prohibitions on speech would not make anti-Muslim sentiment vanish, and that they'd be better off with an approach that could attract international consensus rather than an increasingly threadbare voting majority. They agreed to negotiate. Months later, we had an agreement on a new resolution that emphasized global cooperation on practical measures to counter religious intolerance. The Islamic Conference ended its quest for a global ban on criticism of religion. The Economist described the outcome as a diplomatic coup for the Obama administration and noted that the new approach came as a relief to both sides. Efforts to implement and fortify the new resolution have now been underway for almost a decade. This experience led me to the bedrock conviction that the fight against bigotry and intolerance need not and must not come at the expense of freedom of speech. This idea has been reinforced over 7 years at PEN America, an organization of writers and their allies who come together to celebrate and defend free speech worldwide. We recognize up-and-coming novelists and poets, confer prestigious literary awards, defend persecuted writers, mentor incarcerated writers and others locked out of the literary community, publish reports on pressing free speech issues, and host hundreds of events each year. While we've long worked globally on free expression advocacy in China, Russia, Myanmar, and elsewhere, we've in recent years become alarmed by threats to free speech at home. Although this book is my own work and does not represent organizational policy, my experience at PEN America has shaped my insights and conclusions. Our extensive work on campus free speech has brought me face to face with the demands of students to eradicate the stubborn legacy of racial discrimination and pushed me to explain how free speech precepts are not inimical to that cause, but rather can advance it.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's great. And part of why I think I wanted to also get at some of the history that sort of brought you to this moment was I was also thinking of maybe how we can kind of step back and sometimes just sort of ask the question, well, how did we arrive at this particular moment we're in right now, where, last night at the Republican convention, the speaker comes up and says, well, actually, the left were known as the defenders of free speech. And in fact, we now actually live in a state where somehow that position has been sort of usurped, or now is somehow no longer seen as actually like a progressive liberal idea. And in fact, it's the conservative movement who embodies these sort of ideals. How did we get to this place where even the idea of sort of defending speech might seem somewhat heretical to some?
Yeah, look, I think it's a couple of things. I mean, when you think back to the civil rights movement, free speech protections were elemental to that struggle. The right of people to demonstrate out in the streets in cities that were hostile, the role of the press and the freedom that the press had to cover the protests, the indelible images of dogs and water cannons that were broadcast on television and on in newspaper front pages all over the world were a big part of what enabled that struggle to achieve such progress. And so, the question arises, we're in a new moment of racial reckoning in this country with a rising generation that is driving forward toward the next levels of equality and inclusion and anti-racism here in the US. And, in my view, free speech is every bit as essential to those struggles as ever. And yet I think when we ask ourselves, well, why do people not necessarily see it that way? I think there are a couple factors. One is sort of the level of struggle that we are engaged with now at this point, which is that we're not focused necessarily on structural barriers, equality in employment or in education or in access to other kinds of rights. It's sort of a deeper, more profound level of social transformation that is necessary to eradicate the stubborn roots of racism. And I think the role of expression in that is different and pretty fundamental. Denigrating speech, demeaning speech, slurs, stereotypes, all have this pervasive effect. And so part of the struggle now is sort of how do you tackle that layer of, racial animus? And, people then, ask the question, if this speech is protected, if under the Constitution you're allowed to say all of these things, isn't that just contributing to barriers to equality? And so I think that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is in the last few years, and it's just so ironic to hear Donald Trump Jr., last night wrapping himself in the mantle of the First Amendment because of everything that this administration has done to uncork hateful speech and let it loose throughout our society. In response to that, we've seen an understandable impulse to protect people from the impact of whether it's anti-immigrant sentiment, religious hostility toward Muslims or other groups, racism, misogyny. And so when we have a president who seems to embody and enable all of those noxious sentiments, the impulse to police the realms of society that we can control, whether it's the pages of a magazine or a television show or an op-ed page, intensifies, out of a desire to sure that, to mitigate the harm that people see as a result of this speech that now seems to be, freed, unchained from taboos that, held it back, even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah. I'm curious then. How much do you also see it? If I'm understanding what you're saying, also maybe also through the lens of power, that the earlier sort of movements and the civil rights movements was very vested, obviously, in the sort of institutional transformations and in legislation that could dismantle those forces and those sort of embedded, I guess, sort of power structures. And in now, perhaps, that can we understand speech as actually maybe almost as a sense of like who actually can gain the most control over it, right? Speech and access to speech, as a kind of almost power struggle happening between sort of two different sides of society, between a generation who, rather than looking for structural or institutional change, is actually looking for what you noted as being these sort of deeper seated structural transformations in society. And one way that might be seen as being achieved is through kind of controlling the mechanisms of speech itself.
No, I think that's true. I mean, we definitely have a power struggle underway over speech and who has the right to speak, who has the right, whether people have the right to control speech of others. In this book, what I'm really trying to set out is how can we put forward a vision for free speech that takes all of this into account and that is fit for purpose in a society that is committed to becoming ever more equal, inclusive, and anti-racist. And I talk about things like the imperative of eliminating barriers to participation in our public discourse, whether that's racial disparities that are persistent in newsrooms all across America, where the rates of progress that journalists and editors have set for themselves have been persistently missed. And we see still a very white dominant newsroom publishing industry as well. I know has been historically very white, both in terms of staffing as well as underrepresentation of minority groups in terms of what books are published. And so, in my view, you don't have free speech when there remain high hurdles to participation for people from all kinds of groups and for all sorts of reasons. I mean, translation is another aspect that it holds people back from being able to participate in civic discourse if they're writing and communicating in languages that are not widely translated. And so, that is part of, in my view, sort of a more encompassing vision of what it will take to realize free speech in 21st century America and even around the world is an approach that addresses those barriers, not just a kind of traditional First Amendment approach, which is really focused on government infringements on freedom of speech.
Yeah, what's interesting in the book is the approach is actually, you really come down actually at times really to the level of the individual, right? There's a really strong sense of what the civic responsibility that we as in unique people can bring to this conversation, and how we respond to one another might actually be one of the ways in which we can begin to transform the sort of patterns and structures of speech. You note several times throughout the book that in order for that to happen, though, there is a couple of things that need to be in place. We need to have not only time to reflect about the speech that we're not only using, but also receiving, and also perhaps even at certain moments, a private space where we can actually reflect and talk amongst one another with a kind of openness and honesty that allows for a real transformation of how we see one another. So I'm curious, how do you see us getting to those places, especially when it seems like we're in a culture that strives as hard as possible to make those two things impossible to achieve? Privacy and time, right? Where the reaction and the priority is the immediate response and the public response. So how do we begin to actually pull away from those cultural forces that are sort of chewing away at so many bits of who we are?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do take the view that it is extremely important for us as citizens to play an active role in holding open the space for free speech. If you talk to Americans about free speech, people reflexively bring up the First Amendment. That's how we all were taught. And we sort of have looked at this constitutional provision as sort of the uber safeguard. And if free speech is infringed upon or you're worried about it, you think about lawyers and courts as the solution. And yet increasingly, if we're talking about call out culture or people being canceled or debates over whether particular tweets or Facebook posts should be allowed on the services or taken down, none of those really implicate the First Amendment. They're not about state action for the most part. And so they have to be navigated between human beings. And I do think, as you mentioned, that face-to-face, and, this has become even harder during the pandemic, but face-to-face conversations so often can help us to navigate what seem to be insurmountable differences and what could lead to a fiery confrontation on Twitter. If you could actually pick up the phone, or even better yet, walk down the hall and talk to somebody, whether it's a dorm mate or a colleague in an academic department or a fellow opinion writer at the New York Times, you may be able to avoid coming to blows. And I think it's extremely important to find opportunities to talk about really difficult issues. I mean, I actually did this recently on an issue that I know is extremely contentious, but I didn't know that much about it. So this issue of transgender women who are in a struggle against what they deem sort of radical feminists, and it's essentially biological women, and they have different views about the significance of biological femininity and whether you should talk about women who menstruate or rather people who menstruate. Since not everybody who menstruates is necessarily a woman, and not every woman menstruates. And so it's sort of about the essentialism of femininity. And it's become a very contentious issue. There are all sorts of disputes on Twitter. The issue that, in the context of the Harper's letter that generated so much controversy earlier this summer, that it's the issue that divides Jennifer Finney Boylan, the transgender writer who's a member of Penn's board, from J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series. And so I didn't know that much about the issue. And I sort of had an opening with someone I knew who had thought about it. And I just said, can we get on the phone? I'd like to hear what you have to say. And I want to be educated. And I want to ask some questions that I probably wouldn't feel comfortable asking in a more public setting, just to get my arms around this set of issues. And I feel like that, creating space for those types of conversations is really essential. And people, I think, actually, when you approach it in the right way, are quite open to it and enjoy it as well, because we all are so often kind of locked in this public discourse on social media and on op-ed pages where we have to be extremely careful about what we say, and where it's even hard to ask questions, because if you ask the wrong question, you may be seen as on the other side of a particular popularly held viewpoint. And we saw this on, the whole debate about defunding the police. There were moments where, even asking questions about what that meant, or calling into question what the implications of that would be for communities, could render you persona non grata in certain circles. And, to me, that's inimical, not just to free speech, but to the deliberative process that we need as a society.
Yeah. So how do you then think? How do we begin to, or do we need to begin to distinguish between, those sort of sometimes it seems like there might be sort of cultural sort of shifts and pressures sort of happening, right? And the way the sort of limits and sort of that private space is being reduced, if not kind of annihilated, where the way in which we might be able to communicate in smaller groups isn't somehow tolerated, or there's less room to even accommodate that. How that cultural shift then also begins to affect the way discourse begins to actually sort of perform publicly, right? So how do we create those private spaces, I guess, is what I'm trying to sort of get to. Once upon a time, I think we would have looked at colleges as one of those spaces where perhaps these conversations could happen in a smaller environment. But even that space is no longer necessarily amenable to that. Even that space is sort of about the kind of public performance to a certain degree. So do you see a way in which the culture can perhaps begin to kind of shift enough to allow for some of those private conversations to occur?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I worry a lot. It's funny because there's been so much debate over these controversies surrounding campus free speech, whether it's deplatforming of invited speakers or professors who say something in class that students find to be offensive, and then they call for that professor to be disciplined in some way and sometimes achieve that result. So there are all these conflagrations that have taken place, and we've documented them, many of them as PEN America. White supremacists try to come to campuses to rile people up. And yet I think the greatest threat for campus free speech, I feel right now, is the fact that the campuses have had to shut down due to COVID. And so, all of those dining hall conversations and late night dorm room conversations and give and take in seminar rooms, has essentially disappeared. And I think people worry. I do think it's good for universities to adopt, if they can, prohibitions on taking video of lectures and classes, because I think that's inhibiting for both professors and for students. If you have to worry, I think there's a higher hurdle to taking part in conversation on a Zoom because you don't have the cues and the body language. I don't know if these 44 people here in our audience are bored out of their minds. Are they looking at their phones? Are they nodding eagerly? Are they excited about this? I have no idea, neither do you. And so we kind of soldier on in ignorance about that. Whereas, if we were at Seattle Town Hall, it would be very different, and we could get a feeling of what reaction we were eliciting. And so for students in a classroom, I think that can be very intimidating. You don't see that others are furrowing their brows at the same time and wondering the same thing that you are. And so I think we have to bend over backwards, particularly amid the virus, to elicit these conversations. And I think for each of us, in our daily life, whether it's around the family dinner table or with a friend or over dinner, finding ways to have the difficult conversations. And I have a chapter about how to do that in my book, because I think for a lot of us, it sort of seems harder than ever and often kind of not worth it. Like, is it really worth, potentially ticking off, Uncle Mike by bringing up what you think about Black Lives Matter if you don't think he's supportive? But we actually need to create discourse across our differences. We're in an extremely polarized moment as a country, and we have to find ways to talk about these things. And as at PEN America, we've also done work in communities across the country. We've created chapters in 6 U.S. cities, and part of the goal really is to foster this discourse across difference and be an engine for civic dialogue in some of the communities where we think it's most needed.
Yeah, what it's interesting in the book, because you take actually very prescriptive sort of approaches, right? So it's not just about noting the problem, but actually trying to offer really practical kind of solution as to like how an individual can go about having a difficult conversation, how an individual can be aware of language that might be contentious, or how we can go about making sure that we avoid caricatures in our sort of speech. And one of the interesting things there is that sense that this actually requires work, that there's a sort of effort that needs to be put into place in order for these things to actually happen, right? It makes me think what you had noted earlier about our traditional reliance upon just the First Amendment as a generic kind of coverall to ensure we all had speech. And now we're at an inflection point where it's no longer just about turning to the First Amendment, but in fact doing more sort of tangible, practical, sometimes seemingly mundane, and oftentimes very ordinary and yet nonetheless necessary work. And how do we begin to sort of actually imprint upon people the urgency of that task, that it's not just about getting along with our Uncle Mike at the dinner table, but that in fact, and I think it's one of the things that undergirds the book, that in fact, our sort of democracy and our citizenship is at stake here.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a weird way, I sort of had mixed feelings about Donald Trump Jr.'s comments last night about free speech, claiming that free speech is like exclusively Republican value, and that on the left, the preoccupation with call-outs and cancellations, has run amok and reflects a kind of deepening censoriousness. Because at some level, look, I think it's incredibly hypocritical because the Trump administration has been no friend to free speech. And, in fact, as PEN America, we're suing Trump for his threats and acts of retaliation against journalists and the media. We've just been involved in 2 lawsuits concerning books that he was trying to prevent from being published. He's denigrated reporters as enemies of the American people. So he has absolutely no standing, and nobody associated with his administration has any standing to complain about this. But the substance of the concern that Trump Jr. raised, I think, is a legitimate one. I do think we face a kind of climate of censoriousness on the left. I think the reasons for it are understandable and even perhaps noble, in that I think it is born of this desire to bring about a more equal and inclusive society. But I think the remedy that people have come upon is the wrong one when it translates into prohibitions and punishments for speech. And so that's why I think we have to kind of reinvent free speech for what I call our diverse, digitized, and divided society. And I think particularly the diversity, the question of sort of how we live together in a society that, we're very close to sort of a tipping point where we'll have no single majority ethnic group. And it's quite exciting. I mean, if you watched, I'm sort of giving away my political colors, but watching the DNC last week, seeing that diversity of faces as they do the roll call across the United States, I thought was pretty inspiring. And yet it shouldn't come as a surprise that, as we adapt to living in a society where people from all kinds of backgrounds, are not just here, and they're not also just simply being assimilated and asked to regularize and normalize to a traditional, heteronormative, white dominant pattern of living, but rather being sort of invited and welcome to live as they choose. That's going to require some adjustments, and it requires some adjustments to how we exercise our free speech rights. And it doesn't mean that I believe fervently, it doesn't mean that you should refrain from articulating opinions and viewpoints just because they may be controversial or unorthodox or not well received in certain quarters. I think it's extremely important to say them anyway. But what I try to offer in the book is, here are some ways of doing that are going to hopefully make it more likely that you'll be heard, understood. Maybe you'll even persuade some people to come around to your side of the issue. And you'll also avoid inadvertently offending, alienating, and losing a portion of your audience because of offenses or misstatements or just errant speech that was avoidable and would have been avoidable if you had just exercised a little more care. And so I think this is kind of baked into how we're going to have to live together as a society, and it is going to take a little more forethought on effort on each of our parts to say what we want to say in a way that is calibrated to be heard.
Yeah. So there's so much there, which I have almost a 2-part question. One, as you note, as our society gets increasingly diverse and more perspectives become part of the conversation, inevitably we're going to have more divergent viewpoints, especially on what words and what certain statements and phrases might mean. There's a line in the book where it says, we evaluate speech through our own distinct ideological lens. And of course, those ideological lenses are growing more and more complicated and numerous. So how do we begin to sort of address somebody who says, well, it's not even just an ideological lens, but it's an experience. And from my experience, these particular set of words aren't actually, problematic so much as they're actually just explicitly hateful. Like I hear that, and what I'm actually hearing isn't a different viewpoint, but I'm actually hearing hate speech. I'm hearing something that's sort of attacking my identity. How do we begin to sort of navigate what somebody's experience tells them and informs the way they interpret it versus the person who might be speaking in their intent? And then maybe as a second part, how do we manage being more reflective in our conversations and in our speech without falling into the trap of self-censorship? How do we straddle that gray line between being thoughtful, but also not inadvertently censoring ourselves? Or are we censoring ourselves by being thoughtful?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're great questions. Look, on the first one, I think there, are certain norms of speech or slurs in particular where it feels really difficult to imagine that anybody living in 21st century United States, wouldn't understand that a particular reference, whether it's about Jews or about Blacks or about Asian Americans, would be considered offensive. And I in the book talk about a responsibility of conscientiousness and a duty of care to be cognizant of those things. I think the duty of care, to my mind, increases depending on what platform you have. So if you're talking, if it's your grandfather and he asks at the dinner table, he's not on Twitter, he maybe doesn't watch that much television, and he says, "What's wrong with saying all lives matter?" I think it might be appropriate to simply explain to him, how that phrase is understood and contextualize it, but not to get upset. Whereas if it's a professor in front of a classroom, I think it's fair to have a very different reaction, because that phrase is not new and it's been well and thoroughly debated and widely explained why it's considered sort of insulting to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think you can expect somebody who has a platform, particularly engaged with younger people and a large audience, to have picked up on that and to have gotten the memo about that not being a phrase that you would use. But there are gray areas. I mean, one of the gray areas that I find sort of most illustrative of how difficult it is to really try to draw any hard and fast lines when it comes to hateful speech, and why I think it's ultimately a good thing that the First Amendment in the United States doesn't allow our government to do that. In Europe and Canada and Australia, they can ban and punish incitement to discrimination and incitement to hatred, where we have a much higher, more protective standard for speech, which is that we can only ban incitement to imminent violence. So only if somebody is really urging imminent violence can the government step in. And I think that's ultimately a better approach because of these gray areas. And the example I was going to bring up is Israel-Palestine, which is a very contentious issue on so many college campuses. And you really hear, almost these mirror image arguments. I mean, whether you buy them or not, and how you look through the lens of power may be different for each person. But you hear Palestinian students saying that for a representative of the Israeli army to come and speak on campus undermines their sense of safety and security and humanity. And on the flip side, you hear Jewish students arguing that having a representative of a Palestinian rights organization who argues for the eradication of Israel, undercuts this person's sense of self and their role in history, their family identity, and they both may be very heartfelt in expressing that point of view. And whether it's credible or not, I think it illustrates that subjective feeling of being undercut, if we let that trump and become the new standard for speech that we're going to allow the government to prohibit, could point in a lot of different directions and take all subject matters off the table for discussion, and subjects that I think we need to be able to talk about.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you is that we do sort of encounter difficult speech, and I think this might even touch on some of the questions being raised, is that we should try to refrain from necessarily searching for the authorities or searching for institutions to actually be the mechanisms through which that problematic speech is addressed, and instead trying to respond to it from a more sort of individual or even sort of civic minded way, that we don't need to necessarily turn to the government to sort of censor it, but in fact we should, I'm sorry, I'm actually inverting the argument. The argument being, rather than having individuals be the ones who actually try and censor, that we should actually use the authority, right? Because actually in our country, we do have a sort of a very broad discretion with the First Amendment rights. And that is when we rely on individuals to actually become, that power, that's when we actually end up in these sort of really problematic areas, because individuals might sort of censor based on their own particular experiences or their own emotions. So my question, I guess, then is then how do we allow the authority to become, or how do we trust authorities to sort of be responsible towards addressing those more problematic forms of speech, when some people would argue that they have no trust in the authority as it stands, that in fact the very authority is the thing that they're arguing against. So how can they turn to the authority, whether it's the police or the state or Congress, to actually serve as a check on speech that actually crosses those thresholds?
Yeah, well, look, I don't think that we should turn to governmental authorities any more than we already do as arbiters of speech. I think our system, which really delimits quite narrowly the role of governmental authorities in banning and punishing speech, in discerning between different viewpoints as the basis for rules that govern speech, the authority and the leeway is very limited. And I think, for those who, there's been this sort of clamor and question in recent years about whether we should broaden that authority and whether the First Amendment is too protective of particular kinds of speech and especially hateful speech, and whether we should allow for broader prohibitions of, for example, hateful speech on college campuses. Should we allow for speech codes that would prohibit noxious speech? And I think the risk comes in what you brought up, which is you have to think hard about who's going to be implementing these rules. I mean, right now, we know that if Donald Trump wasn't confined by the First Amendment, that he, very well probably would have sent out troops to quell peaceful protests in American streets back in May and June. He was absolutely explicit in his desire to do so. He also would withhold White House press passes to punish journalists whose reporting and questioning he disagrees with. And so he's made very plain how he would abuse these powers if they vested with him. And it's only because we have the First Amendment and the courts and also our other institutions of government and sort of a societal appreciation of the constraints on the power of even the president to impinge upon free speech that he has had to restrain himself. And so I think he's a very good illustration of the risks. People, when they imagine these mythical laws protecting against hateful speech, I think they envision some combination of Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and maybe Barack Obama, who would collectively have the wisdom to decide where to draw these lines and what precisely constitutes hateful speech and how to deal with speech about Israel-Palestine and a whole host of other contentious issues. But in fact, that's not who would decide. Who would decide is our elected officials at any given moment and our appointed judges. And that's a much more mixed bag. And I think we ought to be leery of giving them that unfettered authority. I feel the same way about Facebook and Twitter, because they have their own motives. They are profit-making companies. Their business models are predicated on privileging the most incendiary and outrageous speech that delivers the most engagement. And so they're not actors necessarily in the public interest. And I think while they do have to play, and they will play, I think we will see them playing a larger role in policing speech, I think we need to be leery about how they do it and ensure that there's transparency and that we can understand what speech is disappearing and that we have recourse for those who believe that their free speech rights have been infringed.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to make sure we get our audience questions in. So I wanted to start with a question from Elizabeth Coppinger of New York. And she's asking, how can we protect our society from hate speech and disinformation? Rwanda is a clear case of the danger of that type of unfettered speech, especially when we see that individuals will believe what they want to believe.
It's difficult. It's nice to hear from you, Elizabeth. Someone I haven't seen in a long time, so it's great to hear your name, and I wish I could see your face. At PEN America, I deal in the book with how I think we can fight against hateful speech. And, the best method is ultimately counter speech and condemnation and rejection and the reinforcement of taboos. I also talk about education and dialogue. And, there are instances where white supremacists have recanted and been brought around through engagement with their political opponents. Sometimes their family members are involved. So there are ways of addressing them. What I will say, and I think one of the most difficult sort of parts of this argument, to confess to is that I'm not sure any of those methods is really fully adequate, especially over the last few years where we've had this environment of hateful speech being enabled from the highest levels of government. But I ultimately, for the reasons I spoke about a moment ago, think we're better off doubling down on these sorts of approaches than we are in authorizing our government to clamp down on its definition of hateful speech. You know, when it comes to disinformation, we've done a lot of work on that issue at PEN America, and it's really interesting. We started after the 2016 election and did a whole study of kind of fraudulent news as a threat to free expression, even though overwhelmingly fake news and misleading misinformation is protected by the First Amendment. You know, it's not illegal to lie or dissemble, and yet we, for a whole host of reasons, identified that it was inimical to free expression and open discourse, because if you have a public conversation that is so polluted by falsehoods that no one knows what to believe, it really undercuts the value of free speech. You know, when it comes to the role of free speech as a catalyst for finding the truth, or for discerning between truth and falsehood, for allowing the best ideas to come to the foreground, all of that is thwarted in an information environment that is flooded with propaganda and disinformation. You know, we ultimately concluded the best way to approach it is sort of defensively, by equipping people to be much more sophisticated in terms of how they absorb information and understand where it comes from. You know, we've lost so many of the indicators of that. You know, it used to be, you know, a book with a spine and a publisher, and there's an editor, and, you know, there are all sorts of gating factors that would tell you whether something was credible and worth reading. And on social media, so many of those are lost or diminished. We've actually been doing trainings all across the country about election-related disinformation, and also following some interesting steps that the social media platforms have taken in relation to COVID disinformation, which have been pretty effective in terms of suppressing quackery and conspiracy theories that people are trying to share on the platforms, and at the same time elevating credible sources of information from the CDC and the WHO. And, you know, now the complicated question is whether and how that should and will translate to the political arena, where the line drawing exercises, I think, are even more complicated and problematic than they are when it comes to the science.
There's another question that, you know, I know it's referenced in the book and ties deeply to the work PEN America has done on campus free speech. The question is, can you talk about the suppression of free speech on college campuses like Middlebury? Yeah,
I mean, sure. We did a whole sort of case study looking at Middlebury. There was an incident, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago, where Charles Murray, the author who had become notorious after publishing a book decades ago called The Bell Curve, which essentially explored a racially driven argument about intelligence that many people believe was racist. He was invited to come to campus by a group of college Republicans, and the idea was he would have a conversation with a political science professor, and the protests against his appearance were so vociferous that he was in effect shouted down. He ended up delivering his lecture from a closet and broadcasting it, I think, over the radio. And then when he and the professor came downstairs and outside, they were thronged by a mob and really kind of physically attacked. And the professor, Allison Stanger, suffered lasting injuries as a result. And it was a pretty traumatic incident for the campus. We actually ended up doing a 2-day workshop at Middlebury talking about it. And some of the things that came to the foreground were, you know, Middlebury is an extremely white campus, extremely, I think, the whitest state of the union. And so for students of color on that campus, were a pretty small group. I think the ability to tolerate, you know, anything that seemed to further undercut their position and their sense of belonging on campus was difficult to tolerate because of that environment. Another piece of it was that the university president had a practice whereby for any lecturer who would come to campus, she would deliver an introduction, and she was to have done that, I think did it for Charles Murray. And so that put essentially the imprimatur of the university on, this lecture. And so rather than simply being the decision of the college Republicans who are empowered to invite who they choose, it suddenly became something that had sort of the seal of approval from the college, or at least that's the way that it was perceived. And so, in our reported analysis of this, we draw a number of conclusions. I'd say just briefly, that we very much favor a system whereby universities have a decentralized approach to who can invite whom to campus. We think that allows for a whole range of ideas to be explored by students. People can follow their flights of fancy. They can hear from whom they want. It could be, a medievalist. It could be a politician. And that's great. And that the university should be very leery of stepping in to reverse those decisions or to cancel a planned speech when a lecturer has been duly invited. I think it's a very different matter when the university is doing the inviting themselves, and that there it's much more appropriate to apply a kind of screen of the university's value system and to think hard about who you're conferring a distinguished lectureship, who's getting an honorary degree, and this question of the seal of approval from the university at large.
There's two questions that I think sort of go hand in hand, and that I think touch on things that are sort of brought up in the book. Really, they go back to about individual responsibility and behaviors, and the roles we play as sort of citizens and kind of active listeners and speakers. And the first question is about what do you think about the anti-racist sentiment that members of the dominant culture need? That members of the dominant culture need to educate themselves rather than seek education. And the second question of sharing some examples of how we can exercise more care in talking to someone who we disagree with on topics.
Sure. I mean, on the first one, yes. I mean, this is something that has come up a lot in our campus speech work. The typical scenario, can be a professor, and there have been many instances like this where they use the N-word in class, and they're doing it as part of, it could be a white professor, could be literature class, and they're looking at the work of James Baldwin or Mark Twain, or maybe it's a lecture on law and the doctrine of fighting words, and they use the N-word to illustrate language that can elicit a fiery and vehement response. And maybe they've been doing this for years, but to their mind, all of a sudden the students get up in arms and get protest the use of the word, the fact that the professor has said it out loud, ask for the professor to be disciplined. I mean, there's a case of Princeton where a whole course on hateful speech ended up being canceled in the wake of an incident like that. And what does come up is this notion somehow that professors don't understand how a rising generation perceives that term and want to be educated. And the fact that for students, whether it's about the N-word or other so-called microaggressions, so fleeting use of stereotypes or denigrating references, something like talking, call it a standard one is, remarking sort of with emphasis about how articulate, a person from a minority group is, with the implication being that was somehow a surprise and you wouldn't expect them to be quite so well spoken. And so the idea that individuals from minority groups are constantly being asked to gently and kind of in an understanding vein educate white people about how different types of speech are received and how mores are changing, and the experience they've had hearing a stereotype voiced over and over again, so that you might think it's perfectly innocent in this instance, and yet they've heard the same trope their whole life, and so they see it in a different vein, and that this is a form of kind of unpaid labor that people are being asked to carry out. And I think it's fair to say that white people need to take it upon themselves to read and research and think about the language that they're using. And, we have this issue now with our communications at PEN America, because like every other organization, we've become ever more sensitive of these issues. And so, who do we turn to look over, the letter or the report sort of through the lens of how might it be received by the different groups and audiences that will read it? And we sometimes find the problem, you sort of want to go back again and again to the same people because they have that perspective. And yet, in so doing, you're asking them to take on all this extra work that isn't quite fair. And I think you have to find ways to acknowledge that and compensate for it because it's real. And, in some instances, there's no substitute. You really do. We had our statement on George Floyd. I wanted to make sure that a number of Black people had read it before we put it out. It felt essential. And yet, it was one among several statements during that time period. So I think it's a valid concern. The other concern is taking care and talking to someone who disagrees with you on a topic from the get-go. Yeah, I mean, here, I think part of it is tone and, how you begin such a conversation and doing so with, a calm attitude of respect and trying to avoid trying to hash things out in the heat of the moment when a controversial instance or outbreak has come up, but rather sort of trying to look for a quiet moment to do it. I think it's thinking through the counter arguments to whatever it is you're going to put forward, trying to anticipate, what are they going to be able to accept from what I'm saying? What are they going to reject? What are they going to bring up? How does this perspective mesh with their life experience? Having facts and figures and research so that you are grounded in the perspective that you're putting forward. And it's not just based on a set of assumptions, but actually doing your homework so that you're ready for the conversation, trying to disarm some of the, I give an example in the book about an article about a controversial topic, the role of the Israel lobby in Washington. And very often when people bring that up, they're accused of being anti-Semitic. And so there's this article by the journalist Andrew Sullivan that I actually thought was very well done because he went to pains in the beginning of setting out his argument to explain, his recognition of Jewish history and essentially to disabuse his readers of any concern that he was coming at this, driven by anti-Semitic or infected by anti-Semitic animus. And I thought it was convincing, and that once you managed to put that aside, you could really engage with his arguments about the role of the Israel lobby, much more on their merits.
And there's one more question that I want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, because I do think there's a hard point that's being sort of suggested here, which is to try to explain why offending others is a higher value than free speech. To think about blasphemy and the way America responded to the Charlie Hebdo murders through self-censorship, rather than holding on to our values of free speech.
I mean, I think I kind of get it because I think about these issues a lot. But I think what's interesting is whether the goal of avoiding offense should trump or override the commitment to free speech. And I think, that is what many people are arguing in many settings, that if something's going to offend or hurt someone, that should be grounds to ban or punish it, or at the very least for the individual who contemplates expressing those views to self-censor, to just put a cork in it and keep it to themselves. And I think that is I would say this. I think that in order to live together in this diverse society, we need to be cognizant of one another. We need to know what the red lines are, what may offend, and we need to be judicious. And so many of the offenses that occur in our daily discourse are, I think, not intentional. They're inadvertent, and they grow from a certain people who are used to operating in a certain milieu. In the 1950s, you could probably publish a letter to the editor and be pretty sure that just about everybody reading it in your local paper would come be the same race as you, come from the same educational background, maybe have the same religious orientation. And now if you're publishing something on social media and in many of our news outlets, that's no longer the case. You're going to a much more diverse audience. It could be a global audience. And so that does, to me, require a greater cognizance in order to avoid unintentional offense. When it comes to expressing views that are considered, where you're making an argument, whether it's about gender differences or racial differences, and maybe it is something that many people would consider deeply offensive, but maybe it's a view that you hold, and maybe it has some basis to it. And I talk about some of the really fraught areas of science that there are scientists who have had difficulty exploring and talking about, for example, racial differences in medicine, because it so easily seems to sort of bleed into straight out racism. And they've found some really careful, thoughtful ways of doing it. And they've also made the point that looking into some of these issues, is actually very important from a public health perspective. These are, conditions or proclivities that do vary across the population. It may not be race, it may be other kinds of determinants that are really at stake. But if we take it all off limits because we're so afraid of offending somebody, it could lead to less effective treatments. And so I think it's extremely important to find ways to talk about these things, but that, very often we can at the least minimize, if not eliminate, offense.
So I think we have time for just one last question, which I think I'm going to try to use as a moment to try to summarize everything that's been kind of said here, which is that, we need, if I think one of the book's strongest points is that, we need to have these almost sort of a cultural sort of shift in the way we approach and communicate and listen to one another. And you noted this early on, that there are these changes that we need to kind of begin to enact now that require us definitely not to censor, not to sort of change legislation, but to just reconsider the way we approach and think one another, and the way we listen, the way we consider each other. So I guess I'm curious, are you hopeful that we are that we have the tools to actually do that, that we actually live in a moment that makes that shift possible? Or do you see us in a moment where we're actually bending the other way?
I mean, I think this is a tough moment, to be honest, because, of all the factors that I talked about. But I ultimately am hopeful. I think the fact that a rising generation of young people is so committed to driving forward a more equal and inclusive society is ultimately going to be a boon for free speech, because I think some of these barriers to participation in public discourse are being brought down. And we see that happening now with moves to diversify, whether it's the publishing industry or journalism. And I think for young people, that's going to be an even more obvious imperative at every step. The question is, will young people feel a commensurate commitment to the ideals of free speech? I think that's, right now, much more of a question. That's really one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is because I think it's so important that as they drive forward a agenda of social justice and try to invent a more equal and inclusive society, that free speech not be lost in the shuffle. And I think, we saw last night, one of the reasons for that, it becomes quickly politicized. It becomes a weapon that is used to fight back against these drives for a more progressive society, is that they're coming at the expense of free speech. And so I think that's an unfortunate byproduct. I also ultimately genuinely believe that to realize a progressive society requires being able to have open debate about what the best policies are, about what the consequences are of different approaches to social justice, to social policy, that we need to be able to hash all of that out. And we can't take these topics off limits in terms of our discussion. So, my hope is to kindle in this rising generation an appreciation of how the values of free speech are not just compatible with their goals, but essential to their attainment.
I think that's just puts us just about out of time. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that conversation. If you haven't had a chance to read Suzanne's book, Dare to Speak, please support our wonderful independent bookstore in Seattle, and purchase the book, and read it, pass it to your friends, and make our world a little better.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne and Dinaw. This has been a really interesting conversation. As a venue and organization that highlights a lot of different voices, that's certainly something that Town Hall considers a lot, the nuances of it. So thank you so much. That's very interesting. And thank you all so much for watching. As Dinaw said, we encourage you to buy Suzanne's book through the Buy the Book button at the bottom of the screen. That'll take you right to Third Place Books website where you can purchase it. If you'd also like to see more Town Hall content, you can follow this Crowdcast channel by clicking the follow button in the top right corner. Thank you both again so much, and everybody have a great night.
Okay.
Bye.